One of the most surprising things about Paul's ministry is that although he was commissioned to be an apostle to the Gentiles, he is just relentlessly persistent about ministering to the Jews, beginning in virtually every city in a Jewish synagogue. I wanted to take you here to the ancient port of Ostia outside of Rome, where there are remains of a first century synagogue, then rebuilt in the 4th century. If you come across the opening threshold, you'll see a well that fed a mikveh, or ritual bath. And before you come into this worship space, you'll actually see the remains of a kitchen. And then here you'll see the steps that I'm sitting on that lead up to the aron, or the cabinet, the sacred cabinet that held the Torah scrolls. And this would have been the open space where people would have sat around the outside and heard the scriptures read and interpreted. Now think about this. On Paul's 3rd missionary journey, after all he's been through, city after city, going to synagogues and in many cases being chased out, Paul has taken a collection to bring back to Judea. And of all things, he ends up in jail because of a false accusation that he's someone else who has started a riot in the temple. And as a result of false accusations leading nowhere, Paul will appeal to Caesar and end up here in Rome to try to clear himself of those charges. There's something ominous about this trip, and it is the result of false accusation and harassment by Jews. And yet when Paul comes to Rome, what does he do? The very last chapter of Acts tells us that 3 days after Paul arrived in Rome, he called together the leaders of the Jews, and he called them my brothers. He said, I've done nothing against our people. He said, but Jews have objected, and I was compelled to appeal to Caesar. And he said, it's only because of the hope of Israel that I'm in chains. Although Paul was regularly presenting the gospel to both Jews and Gentiles, and often making it very understandable in the context of Roman language and institutions, the fact is Paul's gospel was essentially Jewish. And in Paul's letter to the city of Rome, to the Romans, Paul says in Romans 9 through 11, God's calling among the Jews is irrevocable. Paul says in Romans 11 verse 1, did God reject his people? By no means. I'm an Israelite myself, a descendant of Abraham from the tribe of Benjamin. God did not reject his people whom he foreknew, or foreloved, or he chose. Paul will end by describing God's plan for all the nations of the world in deeply Jewish terms. God has always had a plan for all the nations, and he called the Jews to be a light to the nations. Paul never gave up on the Jews because, as it says in the last chapter of Acts, he was declaring from morning till evening the kingdom of God, convincing them about Jesus from the law of Moses and from the prophets. Although the gospel had meaning and relevance and was understandable to everyone, it should have been understood first by the Jews, and Paul would never give up trying, even to the end of his days here in Rome.